right? It's powered by something we're trying to get working down here on Earth. Nuclear fusion.
Exactly. It's the ultimate power source, really. And the materials you sent over, they really dig into the core of it.
Yeah, they do. So our mission today, let's try and cut through the complexity. What is fusion? Why is it so darn difficult? And, what's the big payoff?
Sounds good. Because, like you said, understanding the potential is key. If you're curious about, well, the future of energy, this is definitely relevant.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. What's the basic idea? You mentioned the source material contrasts it with the older nuclear power.
Right. So forget fission, which is splitting heavy atoms apart. Fusion is the complete opposite. It's about taking really light atomic nuclei.
Like hydrogen.
Exactly. Specific types or isotopes of hydrogen. The sources mentioned deuterium and tritium are the key players here, and forcing them to smash together.
Smashing them together to make something heavier.
Precisely. They combine to form a heavier element, like helium. But here's the magic. The resulting helium atom actually weighs slightly less than the deuterium and tritium did separately.
Okay, wait. Less. Where does the missing mass go?
Ah, that's where Einstein comes in. UCL a cat. That tiny bit of lost mass isn't really lost. It's converted into a massive amount of energy. I mean, truly enormous.
Right, that famous equation. So a little mass equals a lot of energy, and the specific reaction everyone's working on is deuterium plus tritium.
Yields helium plus a neutron, and this burst of energy, about 17.6 mega electron volts, or MeV.
MeV? Is that, how much is that in real terms?
Well, at the atomic scale, it's significant. Think of it like this. One single reaction has enough punch. But the real power comes when you imagine trillions upon trillions of these happening every second.
Okay, that starts to sound like serious energy production.
That's the potential, yeah. But actually making those deuterium-tritium atoms fuse consistently, that's where the big challenges pop up, as the sources make very clear.
Yeah, I bet. The first one mentioned is this Lawson Criterion. Sounds pretty technical. What's the gist?
Think of it like the minimum conditions you need for an engine to start and keep running by itself. The Lawson Criterion specifies a critical threshold. You need the right combination of three things.
Okay, what are they?
Plasma density, how tightly packed the fuel atoms are. Then confinement time, how long you can keep them packed together. And finally, temperature, how hot you can get them.
Density, time, and temperature. You need all three to hit a certain level.
Exactly. You need the product of those three factors to reach a specific value to get self-sustaining fusion, where the reaction produces enough energy to keep itself going without continuous external input.
Got it. And speaking of temperature, the numbers are just wild. 100 to 150 million degrees Celsius. Why so incredibly hot?
Well, remember, the nuclei of these atoms, deuterium and tritium, are both positively charged. And charges repel, right? They really, really don't want to get close to each other.
Like trying to push the same ends of two magnets together?
Precisely. So you need those extreme temperatures to give the nuclei enough shear speed, enough kinetic energy to overcome that fundamental electrostatic repulsion and slam into each other hard enough to fuse.
Okay, so you need it dense, you need it hot, incredibly hot, and you need to hold it like that. But at 150 million degrees, what on earth can possibly contain it?
Nothing solid, that's for sure. Anything would vaporize instantly. So this superheated electrically charged gas, we call it plasma, needs to be contained without touching any material walls.
And that's where the clever engineering comes in, right? The sources talk about two main strategies.
Yes, two main camps, broadly speaking. The first is magnetic confinement fusion, or MCF.
Using magnetic fields, like an invisible bottle.
That's a great way to put it, because the plasma is made of charged particles, ions, and electrons. They respond to magnetic fields. So powerful magnets create complex field lines.
They trap the plasma.
Essentially, yes. They force the charged particles to spiral along the magnetic field lines, keeping them confined in the center, away from the reactor walls. The most famous design here is the tokamak.
Ah, the donut shape. We've all seen pictures of those, I think.
ITER is one, right? And JET.
Exactly. ITER, JET, China's East Reactor. These are all large-scale tokamak experiments. They use a combination of magnetic fields, one going around the donut the long way, the toroidal field, and one the short way, the poloidal field, to hold the plasma.
Seems complex. And then there's another magnetic approach mentioned, stellarators.
Right. Stellarators, like the Wendelstein 7X in Germany, also use magnetic fields, but in a much more complicated, twisted, three-dimensional shape.
Well, more twisted than a donut. Why do that?
The idea is that these complex, carefully calculated twists can potentially create a more stable plasma confinement, maybe avoiding some of the instabilities that can sometimes occur in tokamaks. It's inherently more complex to build, but might offer advantages in steady-state operation. Okay, so magnetic bottles, basically. Tokamaks and stellarators. What's the other main approach? ICF.
Inertial confinement fusion. Yeah, completely different philosophy. Instead of holding the plasma steady for a long time, ICF is all about incredibly short, intense bursts.
How does that work?
Imagine taking a tiny, tiny pellet, smaller than a peppercorn, containing the deuterium and tritium fuel. Then you hit it from all sides simultaneously with extremely powerful beams, usually lasers, but sometimes particle beams.
Hit it with lasers to do what?
To compress it incredibly rapidly. The intense energy deposition causes the outer layer of the pellet to explode outwards, which, by Newton's third law, creates an opposite reaction, crushing the fuel inwards.
Like a rocket effect, but imploding.
Kind of, yeah. The goal is to compress the fuel to densities many times that of lead and heat it to fusion temperatures in just billionths of a second. Fusion happens before the pellet has time to fly apart.
Wow. That sounds like setting off a tiny star. And the National Ignition Facility, NIFE, they're the big players here.
They are. And the sources rightly highlight their massive achievement back in December 2022.
Right, fusion ignition or scientific break-even. What did that mean exactly?
It meant that for the first time in a controlled experiment, the energy released by the fusion reactions in the pellet was actually greater than the energy delivered by the lasers to the pellet.
So more energy out than directly in.
Exactly. More fusion energy out than laser energy in. A huge scientific milestone. It proved the fundamental physics works.
That is huge. Okay, so we have magnetic confinement and inertial confinement. The texts also briefly mention some hybrid ideas.
Yeah, things like magnetized target fusion or Z-pinch. Yeah. There's a lot of ongoing research exploring different physics regimes and potential shortcuts. This diversity is actually really healthy for the field.
And it's not just NIF making headlines, right? Tokamaks are also pushing forward.
Definitely. Experiments like GDT and others are consistently achieving higher temperatures, better plasma stability, and longer confinement times. Records are still being broken in MCF devices, too.
Which probably explains the other big thing mentioned. The surge in private investment. Companies like Commonwealth Fusion Systems, TAE Technologies.
General Fusion, Tokamak Energy. There are quite a few now.
Why are private companies suddenly jumping in?
Well, I think it reflects a growing belief that fusion might actually be achievable on a commercially relevant timescale. These companies often bring different approaches, maybe more focused on speed or smaller reactor sizes, attracting significant venture capital.
But there's a catch, right? The text mentions we haven't hit engineering break-even.
That's the crucial distinction. Scientific break-even, like NIF achieved, compares fusion energy out to laser energy in. Engineering break-even, or Q1, means the total energy output of the entire power plant system is greater than the total energy needed to run everything. The lasers or magnets, the cooling systems, everything.
So the whole facility needs to produce more power than it consumes.
Precisely. And no fusion device has achieved that yet. That's the next major hurdle on the path to actual power plants.
Okay, so scientific proof is there, but the engineering challenge is immense. The sources flag material science as critical. Why is that such a roadblock?
Imagine what the inner wall of a fusion reactor has to endure. You've got intense heat, maybe not direct plasma contact if confinement is perfect, but still extreme temperatures. You have very strong magnetic fields causing stresses. And crucially,
neutrons.
Exactly. Those high-energy neutrons produced in the DT reaction fly out and bombard the reactor walls constantly. Over time, this neutron bombardment can damage materials, make them brittle, and induce radioactivity. We need materials that can withstand this harsh environment for decades.
That sounds incredibly difficult, finding materials that won't break down or become too radioactive.
It's a massive material science challenge, yes.
Yeah.
Developing and testing these advanced materials is absolutely key.
And it's not just the materials themselves, but putting the whole thing together, right? Engineering integration.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to marry the incredibly complex plasma physics with the practicalities of a power station.
Yeah.
How do you efficiently extract the heat generated by the fusion reactions? How do you convert that heat into electricity? How do you breed more tritium fuel? How do you ensure robust safety systems? It all has to work together reliably.
And cheaply enough, I suppose. Economic viability must be a factor.
A huge factor. Fusion power will eventually need to compete on cost with other energy sources. So reducing the construction and operational costs of these incredibly complex machines is vital.
Plus, you need rules and regulations.
Yes. A clear regulatory framework is needed for safety, licensing, and public acceptance as the technology matures towards deployment.
Okay, lots of challenges still. But let's pull back again. For the listener, why is tackling all this worthwhile? What's the ultimate promise here?
The potential payoff is, frankly, revolutionary. The sources lay out several key advantages. First, fuel abundance.
You mentioned deuterium from seawater earlier.
Right. Deuterium is plentiful in ordinary water. Tritium doesn't occur naturally in large quantities, but we can breed it from lithium, which is also relatively abundant, using those neutrons from the fusion reaction itself. So the fuel supply is practically limitless.
Limitless fuel. Okay, what else?
Minimal environmental impact. Fusion doesn't produce greenhouse gases directly. And while it does produce some radioactive waste, primarily from neutron activation of the reactor structure, it's significantly less problematic and shorter-lived than the waste from traditional fission reactors.
So cleaner and less long-term waste. That's a big plus.
Huge. Then there's inherent safety. Unlike fission, a fusion reaction can't melt down or have a runaway chain reaction. If confinement is lost, the plasma cools down in milliseconds and the reaction just stops.
Okay, that's reassuring.
And finally, energy density. You get an enormous amount of energy from a very small amount of fuel.
So clean, nearly limitless, inherently safer, and incredibly powerful. It sounds like the holy grail of energy.
It really does, which is why the pursuit is so compelling despite the difficulties.
So what about timelines? When might we actually see this? The sources offered some projections.
They did, with the usual caveats about predicting the future, especially with fusion. But the general roadmap looks something like this. Near term, say the next 10 years, maybe 2025 to 2035, the focus is on achieving and sustaining net energy gain, that engineering break-even we talked about.
Getting more power out of the whole system than goes in.
Exactly. Then midterm, perhaps 2035 to 2045, we might see the first pilot power plants being built and tested, demonstrating grid integration.
Hooking fusion up to the power lines.
Right. And then the long-term vision, maybe 2045 to 2060 or beyond, is the rollout of the first commercial fusion power plants providing electricity to consumers.
But, as the material rightly points out, fusion timelines have often been optimistic.
Extremely optimistic, historically. Fusion is 30 years away and always will be, was the old joke. And we absolutely need that note of caution. The remaining challenges are not trivial.
So manage expectations.
Definitely. However, the recent progress, especially with NIF's ignition and the advances in magnets and private investment, does feel different this time. There's a sense of momentum that wasn't there before, but it's still a marathon, not a sprint.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive. We've looked at the science, forcing light atoms together, releasing energy. We've seen the huge hurdles, the Lawson Criterion, the insane temperatures containing the plasma.
And the two main strategies being pursued, magnetic confinement with tokamaks and stellarators, and inertial confinement using lasers.
We touched on the recent breakthroughs like NIF hitting scientific break-in and the surge in private funding, but also the big engineering and materials challenges still ahead.
Absolutely. Materials, engineering integration, cost, regulation, all key pieces of the puzzle.
And we looked at the why, the potential for clean, abundant, safe energy with minimal environmental impact.
A truly transformative potential if we can unlock it.
Which brings us back to that initial thought of the sun. So here's something to leave our listeners with. If we genuinely manage to bottle a star, to harness fusion power here on Earth, what does that truly unlock for humanity? Forget just keeping the lights on. Think bigger. How could truly abundant, clean energy reshape everything: geopolitics, poverty, space exploration, maybe even the limits of what we think is possible? What new frontiers open up when energy is no longer a primary constraint? That's a future worth thinking about.